Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. My name is Dave Nagel, and I'm very excited to share with my friends and colleagues in the Nyssa School District some information during this webinar using unwrapping standards to develop accurate rigor targets for students in the Nyssa School District. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. A little bit about me and my background. I've had a chance to meet several of your colleagues, Ryan Hawkins specifically as well. But my background has been specifically, for the most part, when I was a practitioner, a middle and high school teacher. An administrator working with common formative assessments now over the last 16 years. But in my work in the field, I spent a great deal of time working with elementary teachers. And so I just want to be straightforward. During this time today, as we're going to look at unwrapping the standards and rigor level. It's applicable across the board. And one thing that I do note is I have a company that I've started, which is called NZJ Learning, which is pretty simple. It stands for Nicholas, Zachary, and Jacob. All three of them are elementary students. And so when you have three elementary kids in your house and you work with educators on a daily basis, to me, you're probably as qualified as any for those of you that have children in your home. So I'm just letting you know that I spend a great deal of time both at the elementary and secondary level, but I wanted everyone to know my background. And I want to be as committed to interactive learning as we can. This is obviously not an interactive webinar, but certainly throughout the session and prior to and after, feel free to shoot me a text or an email with any questions that would come up. There's my Twitter handle, and hopefully you'll have a chance to engage in some interactive dialogue, maybe not live during this webinar, but certainly moving forward here in the very, very near future. So I want to share the success criteria for today's webinar. You will know as the learner you'll be successful when you can do the three following things. You can accurately define cognitive rigor. You can unwrap an academic standard to identify accurate rigor levels and determine how to use unwrapping standards for an upcoming unit of study to determine and plan your instruction and assessment practices. So I'm going to highlight those three throughout the webinar and make sure that you feel comfortable meeting and achieving the success criteria, which is critical for feedback to take place at any level. And I'm just trying to model that here today during our session. So I'm going to pose my first reflection question. You have a working handout in front of you. Take a moment now and pause the recording. And I'm going to ask you to define cognitive rigor. Pause the recording as long as you need, but take 3 or 4 minutes. Define cognitive rigor, and how do you look at that as something you would define? We talk a lot about it in our classrooms and in our assessments. Take just a moment, pause the recording. Look forward to having a conversation with you as soon as possible when we come back together. So pause the recording as long as you need. Be back in just a moment. Welcome back. Thank you so much for taking the time to reflect on that question. What did you come up with? When we look at the actual definition of the word rigor, we see words like hard, harsh, rigid. It comes from the same terminology and Latin root as rigor mortis. So when we think about cognitive rigor in our classrooms, we have to understand where does that term really come from and how do we use it in applying standards and concepts and skills at the level that we want. Some of you might have come up with things like difficult and conceptual thinking. First thing I want to do is kind of highlight what cognitive rigor is not. Cognitive rigor is not about these 4 things. It's not about homework. It's not about classwork. It's not about doing more. Far too often we have the misconception that more quantity of work is rigorous. It's a misconception that some students can't do rigorous work. Or that if we have to support them, that it loses its level of being difficult or rigorous. Think about it. When we are working with our athletes, and if they're having a hard time hitting a pitch baseball, we might take them over to the tee, help them get their swing down, and then come back to the batter's box. It doesn't lose its level of rigor, doesn't lose its level of difficulty. So just because we support students early on doesn't mean that that's the case. And so we're going to use what's called depth of knowledge, DOK levels. And that's the degree or the complexity of the knowledge students need to have within the content of the standards. How deeply does a student need to understand the content to respond to an assessment item? So it's going to be an important point. How deep do they really need to know the knowledge and information when we give them an assessment item or question? And so as we move away from Bloom's, which is a taxonomy, and we look into depth of knowledge, which isn't. In Bloom's taxonomy, the difficulty of the verb drives the difficulty. In depth of knowledge, it's the cognitive demand or context of how the verb is going to be used or required in its thinking. So what does DOK look like in the classroom? Well, depth of knowledge, there is one DOK1, there's one right answer. And you're going to see in a video here in a moment that kind of highlights that. If there's one right answer, we're at a DOK1. Depth of knowledge 2, there might be only one correct answer, but it requires justification. We're going to have to respond to the concept. We're going to have to justify why it was the main idea or the best answer. There's a precipice between DOK2 and 3, where we're having more than one right answer, strategic thinking. And depth of knowledge 4 is extended deep thinking, which most often requires using multiple sources. So I'm going to pause the recording now and ask you to view the video that I accompanied with this webinar. You might have to switch over. Maybe you've embedded into the PowerPoint. But please watch this short video from Engage New York, and then there'll be a reflection question right after that. So you've had a chance to watch the video from Engage New York. Please take a moment now in small groups and reflect on the overview of the 4 levels of DOK. Just like last time, I will ask you to take a few moments and respond to each other and pause the recording as long as you need. I'll pause momentarily, and then I'll bring us back as a group. Welcome back. Thank you so much for taking the time to respond and reflect on that question with some of the ideas you had from watching that video. Now, while it is uses a secondary filter, a secondary example, I think it highlights that element of those 4 levels of depth of knowledge, where that one right answer, 7 years ago, even though there's multiple steps, there's only one right answer. Why was it important? Well, because that justified Lincoln's speech that if all men were created equal, then why would we still have slavery? So again, as we think about the types of questions and items we'll ask our students to determine rigor level, we need to think about what is the depth of thinking they will have to engage in. So ask you now to complete the next activity. This will be one where you'll pause, just like last time, and go through. For the classroom activity listed, what would you, based on what you've had for the overview now, what type of DOK level is that? Take a moment, complete the activity maybe in small groups, come back in just a moment, go through the answers. Based on the classroom activity, what level of depth of knowledge is it? Take a few moments, pause the recording, complete the activity either individually or in small groups. Back in just a moment, we'll go through the responses. Welcome back. Hopefully you had a chance to work in groups and go through this simple activity, but let's go through these now. So here are the depth of knowledge level. Labeling locations on a map. It's either the city of Paris, it's either the Pyrenees Mountains, the main character of a story. Now, if I'm determining the dependent or independent variables in a science experiment, there's a difference. I have to justify why it was the dependent variable, but there's still only going to be one right answer, but there's some justification. How did the main character change because of the setting? Identifying the sequence of events in the story. Those were an accurate sequence of events. Distinguish how the character changed over the course of the story and why. Now we see that level depth of knowledge 3. I'm justifying there might be more than one right answer. Now, place events from historical context in the timeline accurately. That's intentionally why I highlighted that maybe as a 1 or 2. Because I will have to see what the timeline looks like, and I will have to see in terms of what those historical elements are from the text, in terms of how it will go on that outline. So it's possible that it's very simple, or there might need to be some justification. If we go back to the defining the main character, I didn't say any character, I specifically said the main one. And so that's why we would see a depth of knowledge 2 there. And the last one, obviously, if we're analyzing the relationships among different events, certainly there's a good chance there's going to be more than one right answer. Pushes us into a depth of knowledge 3. It's important to remember that DOK is about complexity. It's the assessment question that determines the demand, not the student work. So we would have a maybe more simplistic answer that actually could be at a higher rigor level. It's not about the quantity of student work. I want to show another example of why we are moving away from Bloom's taxonomy, which focuses specifically on the verb. So I'm going to show you here where we'll use the same verb, describe, 3 different levels of rigor, 3 different levels of depth of knowledge. There are only 3 parts of a eukaryotic cell: the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, and the nucleus. There are only so many differences between plant and animal cells. I have to justify them. I have to describe them. But there is a limit, but I would have to justify why plant cells have usually a larger vacuole to store more water. How I would describe a model that represents the inner workings of a cell and how they function together, There's going to be more than one right answer there. So as we can see here, that word describe doesn't give us enough, as we might have thought before when we were looking at Bloom's taxonomy versus depth of knowledge. And why this is also important when we're designing our assessments. When we are looking at the level of depth of knowledge, this will drive the types of assessment items we choose. For example, if there is only one right answer from a DOK response, we can use a selected response or a multiple choice or matching. If there's a depth of knowledge 3, more than one right answer, we're going to need some type of constructed response, either spoken from the students or written. When there is a depth of knowledge 2, we can use either type of assessment item. So this will drive the types of assessment items we'll use with our students to know the rigor level we're assessing them at. Another just short piece that I wanted to highlight was just solid empirical research, which often is common sense, but there's never been a time in most studies where more formative assessment leads to less gains. The more formative assessment we do, the better gains we're going to see. But there is a point where we could see a little bit of what we might call decreasing marginal utility. At the end of the day, between 10 and 15, and we think about a 15-week semester, just over maybe once a week or once every week and a half, that's where we're going to see that best gain for the amount of time and effort that we're going to put into it. So as we're designing our assessments and thinking about how often we need to assess students, right between that 2 every 3 weeks is going to be our target, whether we're at the elementary or middle or high school level. Certainly with our primary teachers that are watching this, there's some foundational skills and foundational learning that once students have, they can accelerate. Without that, they really will struggle. So certainly that comes into play as well. The other thing that I just highlight momentarily is that when we think about as teachers, one of the things I really push all of us on is your success right now, or your success going into next fall, a better way to put that. Next fall, when you come back to Nyssa School District, whatever grade level you're going to teach, your success is dependent upon one thing more than any. It's not webinars like this. It's not the state. It's not the curriculum. It's not Ryan. It's not your principal. It's how well your peers are assessing and instructing and giving accurate feedback to the rigor levels that they're being taught by the people sitting right next to you. If you're a third grade teacher, your second grade colleagues are as important as anything. And it's important that with everything we have to teach, that we focus on the justs. If I ask teachers, what are all the things you have to teach this year? They'll give me a laundry list. They'll give me things that would take up, entire books filled with things they have to. And I would say then, what are the things you really hope next year's the peers who have your students you're going to have next year teach really, really well? It usually starts with this word, just. So now we're going to dig into, once we determine what our priorities are, how to unwrap them and really determine what are the most essential things students need to have throughout the school year, and then what might be those things that we teach in May that we pyramid off of and build when we go into the next school year. And so just highlighting another example, when we dig into this piece on unwrapping, we could have a 5th grade PLC or a 5th grade group that determines from a standard to ask and answer questions to demonstrate understanding of a text, the number of students on an assessment who met that. And then the students that are above and beyond didn't ask and answer more questions. They were able to refer to specific details in the text when explaining what the text says. And for the students in the 5th grade class that couldn't ask and answer questions, well, it wasn't that they were too far off. They could at least refer to details. Or the ones a little below that could at least ask and answer questions to demonstrate understanding of a text. The ones that were really far to go, could they at least ask and answer questions around who, what, where, when, and why? So I'm going to pause the recording now. I didn't have a specific reflection. I'll just leave this slide up for a moment. You can pause the recording. When we dig in now to our piece on unwrapping, this is why it's going to be so important. Because far too often we miss when students aren't getting something that they're not as far away as we think, or maybe they are really far away because the standards build and scaffold. And I'm always one at any grade level, whether I'm working with high school, elementary, middle, RI1 and RL1. In terms of the language arts standards. And those of us who might teach science or social studies at any level, students will be proficient in science and social studies when they are literate to the best ability, when they can close read. If I'm a math teacher, across the board, Park and Smarter Balance assessments, highest failed items in math are the ones that were the highest Lexile levels. So close reading matters. I'm going to pause for a moment. I'm going to leave this slide up, pause it as long as you need, and reflect on what this gets us to think about when we work on our PLCs, how the scaffolding of standards and when we go to unwrap them can really identify what are the rigor targets, will help us know when students don't get it, how far away they are. Or if I was a 4th grade teacher, now I've got targets for 5th and 6th grade for my students that is the next level within the same standard band that I could use the same text, use same resources, but challenge my students appropriately and effectively. Back in just a moment. Welcome back. Thanks so much. Hope you had a chance to reflect on this piece. This is kind of a preview to our next part where we dig into unwrapping the standards. The reason why we will do that is we can think about how any assessment that we design really comes down to 3 points: purpose, evidence, inference. Purpose, and I need to gather enough evidence to make an inference that my students are learning it or how far away they are from learning it. And I will determine my purpose by unwrapping my standards and identifying the accurate rigor level. So I'm going to guide you through several examples, then give you a chance to apply the end of this webinar with some of your own standards and unwrap them, which identifies the accurate rigor targets. So I pulled out Reading for Literature 3.1. The first thing I do when I unwrap any standard is I identify the nouns and the verbs, or the concepts and the skills. So I circle my skill, then I identify what are all of the nouns that my students, all the concepts and the nouns or noun phrases that my students will have to know for this standard. So for this particular standard, we see all of the nouns or noun phrases. We didn't just say events. We said major events. We didn't just say challenge. We said challenges, character, story. And then I put the word respond here intentionally in red, because it's not a skill that the students are going to have to do something, but they will actually have to know what a response is. Now I will take the skill, which was to describe, you see this in your handout, describe how characters respond to major events. They also have to describe how characters respond to major challenges. They have to respond to 2 different things. Left-hand side, all I did is I pulled out my nouns, my concepts. Now I've got my verbs. Now I need to go to my cognitive rigor matrix, which I've included in your handout. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify on the left-hand side, still using Bloom's taxonomy to get us in the ballpark, what was the skill, which in our situation here was describe, and how we can then look across with what we would see for the students in terms of what might they be doing within this particular standard in its context. And again, we're still using that guidance of 1 right answer, justifying the depth of knowledge 3, more than 1 right answer. We can see that when we go into our matrix, describing how characters respond to major events is a 2. How they respond to major challenges is actually more of a 3. It's more than 1 right answer. Let's go on to another one. Reading from informational text 2.6. Identify the main purpose of a text, including what the author wants to answer, explain, or describe. So I'm pulling out my nouns and my verbs, my concepts, and my skills. I was always one taught by Larry Ainsworth to circle and then underline. Now I've got my concepts on the left. Now what we have to do here is we have to identify the main purpose of a text. They also have to identify what the author wants to explain, answer, and describe. As you see in your handout, what was actually in that particular standard. Go back to our rigor matrix. What you'll see is all of these end up being a depth of knowledge 2. Let's do a couple more. Writing standard, right? Informative explanatory text to explain a topic and convey ideas and information clearly. They're going to write, and then after that, everything else are my concepts. They're also, though, going to have to examine a topic and convey clearly. So here now, we've got our nouns on the left-hand side. See what I did here? We're going to have to write informative text to examine the topic, convey ideas clearly, and convey information clearly. So writing is the main skill. But we've listed convey here because when they're writing, they're going to have to convey ideas. But at the end of the day, writing is the overarching skill. But back to our rigor matrix, both of these end up being a 3. So you'll have to write about informative text, write about explanatory text. Examining the topics, conveying ideas, conveying information. So now is your time to take 1 or 2 of your own standards from a current and relevant unit that you might be teaching. And I want to say, knowing you're going to be doing this right after the first of the year, maybe something between Martin Luther King Day and Valentine's Day. What's a unit of study that you know you're going to teach? Select the standards that you would be focusing on, and I'm going to guide you into, say, 1 or 2 at the most, and unwrap them. What will the student do? The concepts, the knowledge, the context, and the level of thinking is always what you need to consider. And you have the handout there in front of you. It doesn't look exactly like this. This was another slide that I wanted to include. That context is why we might be thinking about how we're going to teach it. We'll save that until after we pull out the nouns and the verbs. Don't worry yet about the text. Look at the standard and then make sure that you then can filter that into the text. What can happen sometimes, and I use this example a lot, but students think, the secondary level, that they're learning to kill a mockingbird. They're actually learning complex characters. Students think they're learning about Ramona or something else. No, they're learning about main idea. You're just using that text. So thinking of the context, the text you're going to use isn't a bad idea, but make sure that's not the driver. It's the standard for how I will use my resources. And then the acid test. And this is why if you're working in grade level teams, take a moment and individually unwrap it with your peers and then compare. Would 2 or more teachers come up with the same level of context, rigor, and agreement of the skills when unwrapping the standard? Are you in agreement of what the concepts were, what the skills were, what the depth of knowledge was? If you are, and if you're off by a small piece here and there, you're in the same ballpark. If we have completely different skills we pulled out or different rigor level, that's when we need to have a conversation because we have different levels of understanding of the standards and then different application of the standards in different classrooms. And as I mentioned before, why this is so important is the more accurate our rigor levels, we can target our instruction, which is critical for all of us to be on not just the same page, but to support all of our teachers across the board. As we say, second grade teachers, first grade teachers are accountable to you, you're accountable to third, so on and so forth. So, I want to finish up with our success criteria, as I mentioned earlier. Accurately define cognitive rigor. Accurately define what it is not. We talked earlier, it is about identifying the level of depth of thinking within the standard at the right context, and it is not about more homework or more work or something that involves support means it's not rigorous. Hopefully you've had a chance now to unwrap some academic standards and now use them to plan an upcoming unit of study, to plan your instruction, and then how you'll assess your students. Really appreciate your time. I've included my other email here, dave.nagel. Whoops, I'm going to pause that for a second because I was off on the spelling. There we go. dave.nagel@corwinlearning.net. Please visit corwin.com or gradingforimpact.com, which is my website, for any additional information and any questions at all. Please do not hesitate to send them to me. Hope you have a great rest of your day and a great start to 2017.